They were saying how much they hated their culture, how much they hated their society, how they saw it as being not just not attractive, but actually bad, evil. And they were instead lifting up the people in Hamas as being a better place to go.
People like Hamas, they tend to be slightly more intelligent than their Western oikophobic counterparts because they understand what will eventually happen. Whereas the Western oikophobes are very naive and don't realize that they will be the next on the chopping block. History has shown us, at least in previous manifestations of oikophobia, that a country doesn't really recover from it. And there is no example in history of a country that realized, or a society that realized, wait a minute, what are we doing here? This is horrible, and then kind of pulled back from the brink.
The West is the only civilization in history that celebrates tearing itself down. Have you asked yourself, why are Christopher Columbus statues toppled in American cities? Why were Winston Churchill's memorials smeared with graffiti in London? And why Shakespeare is quietly dropped from university syllabi? Welcome to MCC Brussels and another episode of Deep Dives, the series where we take a more in-depth look into the issues that shape our world and your politics. My guest today says these aren't random acts of vandalism. They're signs of a deeper cultural self-hatred he calls oikophobia. I am John O'Brien, Director of Communications, and today I'm talking to the author, Dr. Benedict Beckeld. He wrote Oikophobia Explained, Why Western Civilizations Hate Themselves, and argues that this mindset is undermining the very foundations of our society. Today, we'll dig deep into where it comes from, how it shapes our politics and culture, and whether the West can rediscover the confidence to defend itself. Dr. Benedict Beckeld, thanks for joining us today to look at the very foundations of oikophobia.
Thank you so much for having me.
What first led you to recognize this cultural self-hatred? Was there a turning point or event that crystallized the idea for you?
It wasn't a one particular event. I think it was just the accumulation of several smaller experiences that at some point triggered these thoughts. We have all, I think probably those of us who've spent a lot of time in academia, or even just a limited time in academia, is usually enough to notice this kind of self-hatred that has become pretty much de rigueur for anyone to be successful in academia. And sometimes not even very blatant, just little comments here and there about how stupid Americans are or about how stupid Westerners are. Anything like this that kind of accumulates, and at some point one kind of wonders, it's interesting that this has become expected. There are a couple of specific moments that stand out in my memory, but I wouldn't be able to go through all of them because really there are so many. But this sort of general assumption in academic circles that the person with whom you're speaking, a fellow professor, a fellow student, whatever it may be, that this person thinks that he knows exactly what you're thinking because everyone else he knows thinks exactly the same thing, that other cultures are beautiful and interesting and exotic and so on, and that the West, of course, we are imperialistic and violent and aggressive and so on. So these thoughts were kind of just there in my mind, and then I came across this term oikophobia that had been coined by Roger Scruton in the 90s. And once I had this term, I'd had these thoughts, but if you have the word for it, of course, then it's easier to kind of build up a philosophical construct around that term. So once I came across that term, then things took off from there.
So how do you define oikophobia? How is it different from healthy self-criticism or cosmopolitanism?
Yeah, so cosmopolitanism and healthy self-criticism, we can answer this question historically and philosophically. So historically, they are stepping stones to oikophobia, which doesn't mean that they themselves are bad. But this is the sort of tragic view of history that one has to take, or at least that I take in looking at the phenomenon, because one can isolate certain phenomena that are quite healthy and that can lead to self-improvement and so on. But that always appear on the way toward oikophobia first. They always appear first, historically, in a civilization. And then ultimately, there's nothing as human as taking a good idea too far. And so that always leads then to oikophobia. So that's the historical matter. Where exactly the line is to be drawn between what is healthy self-critique and what is a sort of pathological oikophobia is a bit subjective. Reasonable people will disagree on where exactly that line is to be drawn, but at some point we see certain manifestations of self-hatred, of self-critique that are so extreme that really they have to be called self-hatred, such as the tearing down of one's own statues, of one's founding fathers, or the smearing of the statue of Churchill with dirt or what have you. At that point, most reasonable people, I think, would agree that, okay, this is not any kind of healthy self-critique, this is really oikophobia. So the line isn't precise, but at some point we end up in a situation where oikophobia is very clearly there.
Why do you think this is a uniquely Western problem compared to other civilizations?
Yeah, so it's not a uniquely Western problem, although it does exist predominantly in the West. I've talked a little bit about this before. So the first part of your question, really, why is it? Well, we could say, why is it more Western than any other civilization? The reason for that is that the various prerequisites, the socio-historical prerequisites that are required for oikophobia to exist, they occur in greater measure in the West. So some of those prerequisites are a very high standard of living, considerable wealth, a intellectually free space where intellectuals can come together and argue and discuss without fear of the powers that be that the church or the state, what have you. And not necessarily democracy, but a certain sense, at least, of egalitarianism. These ideas have existed to much greater extent in the West, which is why we have more oikophobia. You do find oikophobia in the non-West as well, but to lesser degrees, because these things haven't existed in the West, in the non-West, to that extent. And very often, oikophobia in the non-West will come as a direct influence of the West. So you might have, for example, through Westernization, indigenous cultures in Asia or Africa are exposed to Western advances. And so they start to look down with a certain disdain on their own traditions because they see these wonderful Western inventions and this very attractive Western way of life. And they so become seduced by that. And so they start to become oikophobic against their own ancestral traditions. So that does happen in the non-West as well. But again, then that's more as a result of direct Western influence, whereas Western oikophobia is more an organic, homegrown intellectual movement. Well, intellectual might be too charitable, but it's a homegrown movement in any case, yes.
Do you see the origins of oikophobia in the Enlightenment, universalism, or does it go back even further than that?
It goes back, so yes and no. It goes back even further than that, but certainly Enlightenment universalism played a big part of it and was certainly a catalyst in modern manifestations of oikophobia. So we do find the first manifestations of oikophobia in ancient Greece, in Athens, although it's not a coincidence that certain scholars refer to the time of Socrates and Euripides and so on as the Greek Enlightenment. Yeah. They sometimes use that word, and because there are certain similarities here, certain movements toward cosmopolitanism, which of course is a Greek word, and certain movements toward a downgrading of Greek myth and religion and so on as something special, and a raising up of other traditions, intellectual movements like relativism and even atheism come in vogue. And so all of those things happen in the late 5th and early 4th century BC Athens. And so all of those contribute to oikophobia. Then, of course, we do have the Enlightenment being the biggest first modern wave of oikophobia. There are certain prerequisites even before the Enlightenment in the modern era. In the Age of Explorers, you have someone like Montaigne, for example, they take an interest in the exotic cultures that have just been discovered, which leads to certain degrees of cultural relativism. So one sees certain traces of that even before the Enlightenment in modern Europe, but those are really individual cases. So it's mainly the Enlightenment, yeah.
How does oikophobia connect with thinkers like Nietzsche and his idea of resentment, or Spengler's theory of civilisational decline?
Spengler doesn't focus that much on oikophobia. The term itself, of course, is a neologism, but he does talk to a considerable degree about the collapse of religion. And the collapse of religion is certainly a big part of oikophobia. You can never find oikophobia unless there has been a weakening of religion beforehand. Nowadays, of course, you can even find oikophobes who consider themselves religious because part of the Christian church, especially in Protestant countries, to some degree also in Catholic countries, but even more so among Protestants, they have been seduced by oikophobia social justice warriors and so on. So one does find religious oikophobes as well, or quote-unquote religious oikophobes. But by and large, religion has to be weakened first before oikophobia comes in a significant measure. And that's something that Spengler certainly talks a lot about. Nietzsche, when it comes to ressentiment, so Nietzsche's ressentiment is a little more, it's partly self-directed against one's own civilization, but in Nietzsche's case, that's more related to nihilism as a whole, whereas the modern oikophobe, I wouldn't say he's a nihilist by and large, the typical, if you will, at least the stereotypical oikophobe. Rather, he is someone who seeks to replace the own civilization with something exotic. So he hasn't become a nihilist. He has become more, allophile, really. He loves something else at the expense of the own. So his oikophobia is a bit, or his love of the other, if you will, is kind of a compensatory act for his hatred of the self.
Have we seen this cycle before in history? And if so, what happened to those societies?
Yes, so we have seen it in Greece. We've seen it in Rome. The Romans were slightly less prone to it than the Greeks, because the Romans still had this very strong sense of of manliness, a strongly ingrained sense of hierarchy, which did serve as a bit of a buffer against oikophobia. Although one sees the tendencies in, especially late 1st century AD, early 2nd century AD, and even mid-century, even mid-1st century AD in figures like Seneca, and then later in Tacitus and so on. Petronius is another name that's relevant. But certainly among the Greeks, we see it more strongly. What happens to them is not very good. It's obviously there are many causes of civilizational decline, not just oikophobia, and many other factors as well. But history has shown us, at least in previous manifestations of oikophobia, that a country doesn't really recover from it. And if we look at modern countries that we mentioned the Enlightenment before, so obviously France, the French Enlightenment. We should specify, by the way, that I really mean the French Enlightenment when we talk about the Scottish Enlightenment or even the German Enlightenment. That is not as serious of a problem in those places. But the French Enlightenment, we see that the country simply becomes irrelevant and incapable of projecting outward force because it becomes so bent on internal squabbles and self-critique and so on. And thereby becomes opened up to foreign invasion in some form or other. In ancient times, literal foreign invasion through roving tribes. In modern times, not literal invasion, but certainly the opening up of borders to elements that are hostile to the home civilization, which of course we see all around us. And there is no example in history of a country that realized, or a society that realized, wait a minute, what are we doing here? This is horrible, and then kind of pulled back from the brink. One does see counter-reactions, of course. There are reactionary forces, but those reactionary forces have never been able to turn the tide completely. I don't think we should be slaves to history and say that, therefore it's impossible. But so far that has not happened.
We opened with examples like toppled statues, erased traditions. What do you see as the most striking cases of oikophobia today?
Yeah, so those are definitely high on the list, the ones you mentioned. The complete so-called decolonization of university curricula is another. The fact that one no longer is trained in the classics. I always love it when people say, he's very educated because he has a master's from Harvard or something like this. And one forgets that the meaning of terms change, and that a particular term doesn't mean at all the same thing today as it did 50 years ago or even 30, 40 years ago. And so the fact that so-called educated people would have been a joke in educated circles 100 years ago is a sign of oikophobia, because they don't know anything about their own civilizations, about their own cultures. They may be educated by the standards of our day, but that's a rather paltry indication of where we are. So that's one thing. The fact that everyone is called a racist for even daring to uphold his own civilization, or to believe that his own traditions are in some way preferable, not even in a general way, but at least preferable for him, for the time and place where he finds himself. Even that is often considered xenophobic. So
I was shocked recently on YouTube. There was an interview with two young women, two young white British women. And they were saying how much they hated their culture, how much they hated their society, how they saw it as being not just not attractive, but actually bad, evil. And they were instead lifting up the people in Hamas as being a better place to go. What has happened that would cause young people, it's not every young person, I'm not saying that, but cause enough young people to have either that extremist negative view of their culture or a somewhat negative view of their culture? And how do media, academia, and political movements actually amplify this cultural self-contempt?
Yeah, so we've spoken about more on a sort of macro level, how these things happen on a civilizational level. If we're talking about specific individuals, really a big factor is simply vanity. The oikophobe, because the oikophobe want to say it's self-critique. Well, it's humble to be self-critical. Well, no, it's not, because they're not. I mean, it could be, but they're not actually self-critical. They're self-civilizational critical, but they are very self-praising in terms of their own selves. Maybe not explicitly, but that's the implication, because by separating oneself from one's own culture, of course, one is able to raise oneself up all the higher. And very often one finds oikophobes tend to be among the more vain type of people one comes across, because they are, of course, able to stand out. And this is, again, this is a kind of a pattern that repeats itself across the millennia. They are able to raise themselves up by pushing down everything around them. And it's a common thing, of course, especially among young people. One finds it everywhere, but especially among young people, to want to rebel. Rebellion itself is a natural thing, something that young people go through. But that rebellion takes the form of suppressing the entire civilization around oneself, because that way one may stand out all the more. When it comes to Hamas, I mean, they have the same goal. Once, of course, they were to achieve the goal, as always happens with revolutionaries, once the revolution is successful, they turn on each other. And, of course, that's exactly what would happen if oikophobes and their Islamic allies were to win. Of course, they would turn on each other eventually. But they are allies of convenience, because they both desire the destruction of the West. In this particular case, the people like Hamas or Islamic anti-Westerners, they tend to be slightly more intelligent, much as I hate to say so, than their Western oikophobic counterparts, because they understand what will eventually happen. Whereas the Western oikophobes are very naive and don't realize that they will be the next on the chopping block.
Do you worry that rejecting oikophobia could slide into blind nationalism?
Not really, because, I mean, it can in certain individual cases, of course, and it has. One already sees it. The reason I say I don't worry so much about it is because, first of all, because it is by far at this point the lesser of two evils, and because I think that it depends a little bit on what country we're talking about right now, but because I think that there are still oikophobia will never be completely defeated, so that even if there is the rise of a certain blind nationalism, there will still be sufficient remnants of oikophobia left, or of this kind of left-wing wokeism left, if you will, to serve as a counterbalance to that. So that's why which is not to say that I endorse blind nationalism, but it means that I don't think it's such a great threat as it might be made out to be. I mean, one sees certain, of course, certainly in the United States, where I'm from, certain aspects thereof where the right as well now is growing increasingly, not just nationalistic, which in and of itself is okay, but a sort of nationalism which turns toward anti-Semitism and toward a complete lack of understanding for anything that is not like itself. So that's certainly a risk. But I would say right now it's certainly the lesser of two evils, yeah.
You worried me a bit earlier on in this conversation, because you said that it's very difficult for a society to pull out of this nosedive. But what practical steps can societies take to counter oikophobia without silencing dissent? Are there civilizations that have gone through some similar cultural crises and actually come out stronger?
No, not really. There aren't. But I would take, again, the present-day United States as a bit of an example. Again, there are these, as we just mentioned, these other factors as well, this sort of blind nationalism and anti-Semitism that is dangerous and that one has to watch out for. But But a conservatism that genuinely believes in itself, I do think, can serve as a model for Europe as well, because we have now in the United States a conservatism that isn't bashful. One problem that I have with so many European conservatives, this is less the case in Eastern Europe. I mean, I've been spending time in Hungary now recently, and one doesn't really see that problem as much over there. But certainly conservatives in Western Europe and Northern Europe, they're still squeamish. They're still bashful about what they believe. Conservatives in the United States are not. They proudly display their crosses. They proudly go to church. They proudly wave the American flag. And that's something, that is to say, they embrace a positive vision. Too many West and North European conservatives are focused on just resentment against that which they wish to defeat. That is important as well, but they have to be able to find something positive to hold on to, because that's ultimately what inspires people. And I think the Americans are better at that right now than the Europeans. So I think taking a cue from American MAGA, again, without those particular elements that have become blindly nationalistic and anti-Semitic and so on, but there is a positive part there that I think it can serve as an example.
I think that's really insightful. On a personal level, how did writing the book affect your own sense of identity as part of the West? Well, what reflections did it leave you with?
That's an interesting question. No one has ever asked me that before. I think that for me, I was already writing the book was mainly just labor, in the sense that I had the idea of the book very suddenly, and the book crystallized itself almost fully in my mind in a matter of minutes, and the rest of it was just writing out. And so I'm not sure if it changed me that much, but one thing I would say is that, and I say this in the book itself, which is that the book is really a love letter to the West. In the book, of course, I criticize the West a lot also, because I outline these things that the West is victim to cyclically over and over and over again without seeming to learn from it. But it's a critique that is directed against an object that I love, and which is part of why it saddens me so much to see what's happening now, especially in Western and Northern Europe. But I think probably if I had to say one thing as an answer to that question, it would be an intensification of the love that I feel for the West, and thereby, unfortunately, also the sadness that I feel about what is currently happening.
If you had to summarize your message to Western societies in one sentence, what would it be?
It would be, you can only love others if you first love yourself, and you can only respect others if you first respect yourself. And that's on the more spiritual level. On the more practical level, I would say have lots of children, and go encourage others and yourself to go to church more often. It doesn't really matter so much if you believe it. Of course, it does matter if you believe it, but even if you don't, embrace the aesthetic aspect of it and realize that it's something beautiful that we can all share together.
Dr. Benedict Beckeld, I want to thank you for writing this book. Encourage people to read it. It really is insightful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Dr. Benedict Beckeld, thank you for joining me and for sharing your insights. Whether you agree with his argument or not, one thing is clear. The question raised in this book go to the very heart of how we understand our past, our identity, and our future. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, share this episode with your friends and family, and join in the discussion. What do you think? Is the West suffering from cultural self-hatred, or is this just the messy process of progress? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time on Deep Dives. This is John O'Brien signing off for MCC Brussels.